So welcome to Semiconductor's Artist Talk that's produced in association with Fabrica as part of the Earthworks exhibition. And Ruth and Joe, you're here to talk about a few of your other works so that we can really start to dig into your practice over time and over a series of different projects and explore some of the recurring themes within that. I think you're going to introduce a few of your projects first, and then we've got time for conversation and also some questions that we've received from the audience to put to you to dig a bit deeper.
Great. Yeah, we're going to start off by just talking about three of our works, all which work with scientific data in one way or another. And we're going to try and talk about these very briefly so that we can allow more time to kind of delve into the ideas behind them. So I'm going to start off by talking about a piece of work called Halo, which we made in 2018, and it was commissioned by Audemars Piguet in collaboration with the Science Laboratory CERN for an art exhibition called Art Basel, an art fair. I'm going to just play a short video which I'll talk over, which gives you a basic introduction to the work. And Halo is an immersive installation. It's this 10-metre cylinder that you can see in the video, and it has a 360-degree projection, and projected onto that screen are points of light, which is data which has been collected by the ATLAS experiment on the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And about 180 vertical wires run around the outside of the cylinder, and according to where the points of light fall on these, they are hit and they start to resonate and they create sound. So you have this synchronized and localized sound and image. And as you can see in the image here, there's tiny little hammers that hit the strings and build up this resonance until you end up with this humming and vibrating structure. So in 2015, we were artists in residence at CERN. We spent 3 months there. Really, we were interested in looking at the tools and the processes that scientists use to study particles. And there's this 26-kilometre tunnel, which you can see on this image as a graphic overlaying the landscape where CERN is based, between Switzerland and France. And they fire particles close to the speed of light as a way to collide these and understand the fundamental makeup of matter. And so at one point on this tunnel, there's a large experiment called ATLAS. There's 4 experiments in total which go around it. And this image is quite typical. It's called an event display, and it's quite typical of a very visual way that scientists use to represent the data that they're capturing. So in the centre of this kind of purple cylinder, which you can see in cross-section here, and you can see all these orange lines coming out from it. That is the point at where the particles collide. And then they'll track information about those particles, what their energy is, different elements which help them understand what that matter is. And then they'll use these very colourful techniques and blocks for them as a visual language to understand what that is. But for us as artists, we're really interested in going back to what we call the raw data. So we're interested in the data when it first come out of the experiment. We're interested in trying to understand what that is, what that represents, and how we can experience that. And when we experience that, what it's telling us about nature. So to access this data, we have to work very closely with the scientists. And we were very lucky to meet a physicist who works between CERN and Sussex University, and he's called Mark Sutton. And he was absolutely instrumental in us being able to access this data, because he had to go into the archives and all the data is kept in this very specific format, which then we had to translate into a format we could work with. And then we worked with our programmer to translate it in a way that we could bring it into our own software, which is what you're seeing here. We're seeing all these millions of points that are created from this collision brought into our software. And then from that point, we start to try and make sense of it. This is one of the 60 animations that we worked with. And we had to put the time back into that data. So the time stamp is of no interest to the scientists in their data. So we worked very closely with Mark again to understand how these particles would have moved through the experiment, and then had to reanimate all of these individual points to bring that data. And the time frame that they're working with is really interesting. So they measure these events in microseconds, and 1 microsecond is a millionth of a second. So you start to understand how kind of inaccessible within the realms of human perception that time frame is. And so what we do is slow that down so that you get to experience that occurring within a human time frame. The structure of the installation is also very much informed by the experiment. So it's not about illustrating the science in some way or the way that it captures, but it's about giving you a sense of the technology and the kind of human framework that is present in the capturing of the data. And this part of the instrument that you're seeing here is the transition radiation tracker, it's called, and it has all these hundreds and thousands of straws. And inside each of those straws is this copper wire. And these particle detectors, as they're known, they've been using them in particle physics for like tens of years. And when you walk around the CERN campus, it's really amazing because you can come across old ones and they'll have different variations on all these copper wires stretched out in all these big cylindrical tubes. And sculpturally, they're really beautiful, you know, and I know lots of artists have gone there going, oh, I really want that object. It's so amazing. And we always thought we would use it sculpturally in some way. Not necessarily with this work, but at some point it became obvious in the research process that these would become the strings and kind of like the piano wires that would become like play the sound. So it was a very nice sort of serendipity. And a nice story about that is when we were presenting this work, when it was in progress at CERN, we were speaking to one of the engineers, and he said historically the engineers, when they're testing the tension of these wires, they would quite often pluck them to listen to the sound to make sure they were getting the right tension. So there's a nice kind of coincidence going on there. So obviously the sound is really important in the work. It plays just as important role as the image. But we haven't tried to tune the sound in any way. We're trying to deal with kind of the natural resonance of the sculpture in the same way that we want to work with the data in a purer format as possible so it retains its own characteristics. We want to work with the sound in the same way. And here in the image you can just see that there's quite a lot of complicated setup for the sound. And inside each of these sound boxes there is multiple circuit boards, custom-made circuit boards to drive all of the sound and build up the resonance. So it was quite a complicated setup. So the next work we're going to talk about briefly is a piece we did in 2014 called Cosmos. Joe's going to talk about that.
I'll introduce this piece. So this is a piece of work called Cosmos that's in a forest called Alice Holt near Guildford. And it's a 2-metre high wooden sculpture with data from the forest carved into the surface. And we were interested in how this experimental forest captures carbon sequestering, and how forests and trees breathe in carbon dioxide and their cycle, which happens on a daily and an annual basis. And so this information deals with time and weather conditions. And the experiment is this 28-metre high tower that captures the wind vector and the weather and the carbon in the atmosphere, different heights above the forest, tree level and at the ground level. This experiment is dealing with a mature forest, but these are pieces of information that you're unaware of while you're in a forest. And we wanted to make it into a tactile, tangible experience, which is information you can read almost emotionally. So if you go to the next image, you can see the information is captured into waveforms. You see the daily cycle of the carbon in the atmosphere being breathed in and breathed out from the forest. And then it's also, you might go to the next slide. This Daily information also exists on a yearly, annual basis that creates these patterns of more carbon being collected in the summer and less in the winter. And all of these layers of information, we then just treated as waveforms that can be carved into the surface of the sphere. So we wrapped all of these interference patterns, layers of information over the surface and had this carved into the surface, which was then finally burnt to create the sensation of the carbon being sucked out of the air into an actual surface that you can see. And then finally, all of these different pieces of, like a jigsaw puzzle, were stitched together. It's still just about surviving.
It's still there. So, we're going to the last piece to talk about is Earthworks, of course. We'll just dip into the process behind making this a little bit. So for anybody who's been or is coming to Fabrica to see the work, they'll know it's a 5-channel animation and sound-based work. And you have this screen which zigzags across the space. And the beginnings of the work were inspired by a visit we made to a quarry in Spain, which is owned by the company who commissioned the work called Serige. They also have an art foundation. And it was amazing that you could read in the face of the quarry where they're digging away all of this gravel. You could see all the layers and read the layers of the landscape. So it once used to be a riverbed, and gradually over time you can see how that river has shifted across the landscape. And you can see the layers that have been deposited in the riverbed. And so we went looking for ways that scientists try to create an understanding of this process and how landscape is formed, and being very specifically interested in this strata. And through this research, we came across the technique of analogue modelling, which has been used by scientists for hundreds of years, but with different degrees of technology. And it's essentially taking, we call it a fish tank, and then they'll put in different layers of coloured sand to replicate the different layers of landscape. And these days they can use different sized particles and then quite accurately replicate landscape formation. So by applying pressure and motion to simulate tectonic forces, they can then, there's a short little animation here, they can then recreate this landscape formation. So this was really a visual starting point for us to think about how we might work with this and how we might think about introducing time into these environments so that we could start to, as a humankind, to experience that landscape formation. So something we've worked with before is working with seismic data. And we've worked with earthquake seismic data. But in this instant, we went looking for different types of land forming and land shifting seismic data. And we ended up working with 4 different types. So we worked with earthquakes, we worked with volcano seismic data which had been collected inside glaciers, and then we also worked with the University of Barcelona, which is where the work was first shown, to collect seismic data from the quarry. So we both worked with that team, and then we also worked with their analogue modelling laboratory, where we spent a few days to learn about that process. So our thoughts with the seismic data were that we would turn this into sound, and we can talk about this a bit more in a bit. And then we would also use that same data and sound to animate the image. So we've always worked in this way where we almost treat sound and image as if they're the same thing. They're a material that we work with. And so by bringing them together, we introduce a very sculptural process. So it becomes something that's very physical, something which is digital becomes analogue in many ways. And so to create the final animation, we built ourselves a tool which worked with millions of particles and had lots of layers, and the colours we introduced, which were based on geological colours in maps. And then we introduced sound so that over time the layers become more and more distorted and introduce these waveforms until by the end it's like completely noisy. So we'll finish there talking about those.
Thank you for that. So fascinating to hear you talk about your work, and there are just so many different layers in the material you're working with and the process. But I wanted to start, if we could, on our conversation from the audience experience, because we're sitting here in the space where Earthworks is being presented in Brighton. I've had messages from friends that have been to see the installation since it's been open, and everyone is remarking on what a kind of profound, sort of visceral, experiential experience it is. So yeah, I've had a friend that came in, she said she sat on the floor, she wanted to feel the bass, you know, there's photographs of kids running up to the screen and wanted to almost immerse themselves in it. And this language of immersion and, you know, creating these quite sort of overwhelming sensory environments, that seems to recur in your projects. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what it is you're interested in by putting people into those immersive sensory environments.
Well, although these works, often people just say we work with art and science, really at the heart of our work is about human experience. It's about how humankind perceives nature and the physical world around us. So that's always been our starting point. We haven't always necessarily recognised that. But, you know, when we're thinking about, say, with something like Earthworks, we're thinking about what the limits of human experience are, what colours do to us, what motion does to us. We don't notice that we're considering them so much anymore, but we're always thinking about people in the work. You know, especially in this environment, it becomes like a stage, and without the people, the work isn't complete. You know, we're not putting people on the screens and telling a story in the same way you would with, say, like a narrative filmmaking or something. And so that is always like really key to kind of making these work. And with something like the seismic data, we try to look at nature and present it in a way perhaps that people haven't experienced it before. So there's still some sense of familiarity. It's not completely alien to you. You know, with the seismic data, it's science data, but it's incredibly rich and organic sounding and feeling, because you do feel it. And so you feel a connection with it and you don't necessarily understand why. And similarly, you've got this motion that's introduced, and that's being made by the data, which comes from nature, but it sort of has this human signature. So we're dealing with these kind of undercurrents of how we sense the world, but we're not necessarily directly attuned to them in some way.
It feels like you're actually tapping into a different form of intelligence that's somehow kind of hardwired into us through that, you know, something instinctual or sensory. And I think what's really interesting about Earthworks is that people can come into it, you know, they can wander in off the street, but the journey between those 4 chapters and how it manifests sonically and visually, you know, how busy and hectic and really quite intense the quarry section is, you know, it provokes this kind of response in people. So you know, you're really connecting to what's happening in that time through quite a bodily reaction. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how the data, starting with Earthworks, but potentially we can open out, so how this data that you've managed to get hold of is worked with as a material, because when we spent some time in the installation together, you were very clear, we are not sonifying the data. We are working with the raw data and we're analogue modelling. So you're working with it in a different way. But I'm really interested, could you talk about that a little bit more and how that manifests in the sound and also the visuals that are in the work? Yeah,
we often search for different types of scientific data that in a way is as close to nature as possible. So, you know, we like to think about nature being something that you can never experience directly. You have to interpret it. And so we usually do this through science. And that, you know, with seismic data, you are literally getting a vibration from nature that is collected as a waveform. And that waveform can then be literally translated into sound. So you're hearing the direct wave. There's no translation there, or there's almost no translation there. And that creates a connection with what's actually happening that is full of all the noise and the dirt of reality. And all that we do is speed it up from something that's below audible threshold to something that we can hear. And what's so beautiful about seismic data is that it has a really broad spectrum of sound. So you have low sounds and you have high sounds and the full gamut of audio range that, you know, the human ear can hear. And that's one of the reasons why it's so beautiful to work with, because you can really immerse yourself into hearing every bit of detail that's going on in that information. And the other reason why we like seismic data so much is that each type that we use in Earthworks really sounds and feels like what it is. So the earthquake bit section and the glacial section, they sound like what they are. And then when you hear the human section, which essentially the sound of the Anthropocene, it feels mechanical. It feels like human mechanical noise, not something that you would hear from organic nature. Usually when you look at scientific data, it's not something you can literally translate from raw nature into something you can experience. It's something that is more just points of information here and everywhere, and then to make that into an experience, you'd have to sonify it by putting a kind of human notation system onto it. So that's something we did a little bit with Halo, where the Atlas experiment is creating a cloud of points of information, and then we had to translate that into something by assigning points of light and sounds on hammering on strings. But again, we tried to create something that was as closely directly connected to the experiment and to nature as possible, rather than say assigning C and D and E notes to different points. We wanted to create a spatial arrangement that you can physically experience, but based on how the data was collected in a physical space. So it's not about anthropomorphizing data. It's about physically connecting the human experience. And so that's all of our works deal with this in a way where we try to have as close a direct translation with the raw data, which is how the scientists describe the first layer of data they get before it's cleaned up and made into a science product.
It feels like such a fantastic gift to be able to experience and perceive things that are normally so far beyond our realms of perception and experience. So that translation is it does something pretty special from an audience perspective.
I think we're so familiar with consuming science through a kind of story that is a verbal or written illustration of what the scientists want you to understand. And with when you listen to this seismic data out of context, you get something from it without having a literal illustration of what it is. And that's the power of art in a way, in that you can create an experience that goes beyond kind of the normal ways of hearing an illustration, a story, an example. It's something where you can change the context. It changes the way that you perceive the world through, looking at something from a different angle.
We've had some really fantastic questions from the audience as well. And one I wanted to ask about was, were you surprised at the result that turned out? Was it different to what you were expecting when you started at the beginning of the idea, or did it come even to you with that close relationship to the data as something of a revelation?
There's always surprises, which is really nice, because we've worked with visual data, with sound, with seismic data, lots of different types of scientific data. And several times I can think of specifically when we've worked with a certain area of science and a scientist might get in contact with us, or we come across other data and we just think, we've kind of done that already, we've been there and we know that. And then we go through and when we explore this data with the scientists, and then it's really surprising. And so we know that we have a lot to learn from that. We come along with a lot of preconceptions about what we're thinking. But specifically in Earthworks, for me, I really love the glacial data, because it really does sound like you're sticking your head inside a glacier. And we've since been in touch with some of the scientists whose instrument that is. We had several oblique contacts after coming across that data. And we've been trying to find more glaciers in the world that are being monitored in this very specific way. But we've discovered that the specific instrumentation that they're using, they're looking at a wider frequency that most other people are looking at. So there isn't that kind of rich quality to it. So it seems like this one particular glacier, which is in Alaska, seems to be the only one that's collecting, having this richness. But hearing that, the first time we heard that, we were kind of blown away, because there's so much information you can get from it, and it really does just sound like a recording. So in that sense, it's really difficult, I think. It's difficult for us, it's difficult for an audience to get their head around that they're listening to they're listening to the data of it rather than the actual object.
Sticking with Earthworks briefly, we've got another question from the audience, and they're just interested to know a little bit more about how the visuals were made. So that translation of data into sound, you've spoken about how we experience that, but the visuals that match that, you mentioned sound and image, they matter to you.
Yeah, so we built a kind of animation tool that recreated all the layers of a landscape, and through algorithms we attached the sound to all these different layers. So there's multiple inputs of seismometer information coming from different directions, so that the seismometer networks are all over the world, and so we could collect multiple sources, and then each of these different sources that would be hearing the same, say, earthquake at different times based on how far away they were from the original event. The sound would travel, and then we'd attach these to different points of the image. So there's background movement and there's foreground movement, and there's different layers, and then the whole thing would shift and move physically connected to the sound. And this creates a sense of synesthesia, where your mind confuses the sound and image. And this is one way that we create a physical and emotional response to the scientific data, so that you're receiving information in a slightly different way than you normally would, and it destabilizes, the familiarity of how you consume information, and your mind builds new patterns and new connections.
I wonder if we could dig in a little bit more into this relationship between artistic practice and scientific research, and your experiences of working in all these very different contexts. I'm particularly interested in this. I run an art centre that's on a university campus, and you collaborated with some of the academics at University of Sussex on Halo. But over the course of your career and the development of these different projects, how has your relationship to that changed, that sense of being a co-researcher with others in another discipline with a different way of working?
Yeah, it's really changed. I think the first residency we did in a science lab, we'd had like some small collaborations with people before that, but the first time we went into an actual science lab was in 2004, and it was a NASA Space Sciences laboratory. The Arts Council England were funding international artist residencies, and they had these relationships with the laboratory. So it was the first time artists had gone in to that lab. And they're space physicists, so they're collecting data and looking out at space. And we had no experience of doing it, so it was kind of quite terrifying, the thought of going into somewhere like that with all these specialists, with all this knowledge. But we sensed from the beginning that it was important for us to be able to go in fairly naive. We knew that we wanted to get the story from the inside, not the outside. We didn't want to learn about the science in the way that the scientists were trying to tell us, or the science communicators were trying to tell us. We wanted to have a rummage around and see what we could find. And so really that meant kind of interviewing scientists. We never felt like we were really in control of that process, because we purposefully kind of stayed very naive. And sometimes that would disappoint scientists, because they would think, they're used to being in this environment where you come with the specific, if you're in that environment, you have a specific knowledge. Like, scientists over the years have asked us if we studied geology, or depending on like where we were, or physics. And, we've purposefully stayed away from that, because we're trying to dig deeper and find those languages that haven't been explored yet and haven't been used, and making our art. And quite often we talk to younger artists these days when they're going in to science laboratories, and they might ask us about, well, what do I tell the scientists I'm giving back to them? I say, you don't have to tell them you're giving them back anything. Things will come from it, and there's no denying, and sometimes it takes a while for those things to appear. But you are there as an artist to make art, and you are just as valid as they are. You have been decided. And that's what was lovely at CERN, actually, when we went there. I mean, that was the last residency we did in a science lab. And I think because they have generally throughout the community at CERN, there's this understanding that they're all working towards this goal together. That, I mean, some people might argue against this, but there's this sort of, you get this sense of this harmony kind of going on. And I think part of that is to do with that they're doing what people would refer to as pure science. So there's no other agendas on the table apart from the science goal that they're aiming for. So we were as welcome as the physicists, the theorists, anybody else. They were like, somebody's decided you have a right to be here. So it means that you can get on with your job a hell of a lot easier. That means you can go in, you can focus and do what you need to do. And there was a lovely example of this was when we were going into this massive hangar at CERN. So CERN is an enormous campus, and it has not just the Large Hadron Collider, as you well know, because you've spent time there, but it has all these other experiments. And one of these enormous hangars, we kind of poked our noses in one day and then managed to meet somebody, and they're making and experimenting on the large magnets which go inside the Large Hadron Collider, which help the particles move around this tunnel. And so there's lots of engineers and there's lots of making going on. And we were quite keen to go in and do some filming. And we spoke to the right people and they all decided it was fine for us to go in. And then after a few days of going in there, every morning all the engineers and technicians and scientists would all go around shaking each other's hands. Bonjour, 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 bonjour. You know, and everybody would welcome each other. And just within a few days of being there, we were part of that process. Suddenly being welcomed, they say, well, what do you need? This is what we're meant to be doing this week, getting this machine up and running. And suddenly we were part of those discussions and they really thought about us. So, you know, it's a very interesting journey that you go on going into those environments. And I think we feel very privileged that we've been able to do that and witness kind of some of these amazing endeavours that are happening in science.
It's a real balancing act for us where we like to be both naive and knowledgeable at the same time. We want to be, you know, able to be excited about new things, but at the same time, you've got to know enough to ask the right questions and to know what you're looking for. So it's a real balancing act. And it's the kind of the same thing when you apply for these opportunities as well. You know, the people that write that create these opportunities, they all expect you to say a specific idea that you'll go in and you'll do at these residencies. But of course, there's no point in doing a residency if you already know what the outcome's going to be. You need to go in with an open mind to find out, discover new things, and do something you didn't expect you were going to do in advance. So in a way, you've got to play this sort of winning-losing battle all the time where, you know, you've got to be able to risk it all and win over people in advance, saying that you know exactly what you're going to do. And, you know, I think this, in a way, a metaphor for what it is for artists in general. You know, you've got to, always play, you know, naive and, you know, and the genius at the same time.
So in that context of asking naive questions, I wonder if you can remember moments where your presence and your way of looking at things and inquiring about things has provoked revelations for the scientists or provoked them to think about things in a different way or approach their work differently.
Well, there was a film we made called Do You Think Science? Maybe you want to say something about that, because that was quite interesting. Yeah. That was very early on, wasn't it?
We showed that here in 2008 or so. And after our time at the Space Sciences Lab, we'd always do an interview and then we would sort of build up to this big ultimate question. We'd ask all the scientists, you know, do you think science can understand everything? And of course, a lot of the scientists thought we were asking them a kind of religious question, but it was really the idea that science has these big statements like theories of everything, especially in physics. You know, what the hell does theory of everything mean? You know, and this scientists would always have their very personal idea about what we meant. And it was really interesting to kind of, you know, turn the table so that we ask them an unanswerable question. The response and the way that scientists see our work is always interesting because for us, you know, art is about seeing the world in a new way rather than illustrating it. And a lot of the scientists initially expect that we'll come along and illustrate their work in a way that the public audience can take in the information that they want to give out. But that's, for us, that's illustration. That there is a place for that. But for us, art is about changing your viewpoint, and art doesn't even have to be real or right. It's simply just shifting, turning upside down in a way your preconceptions about how you're supposed to think about something, and the more perspectives you have in the world or on things, even if they're right and wrong at the same time, it creates you a bigger perspective. And and in a way, that's what we hope to do with things like Earthworks, is create this way of seeing the world in different ways. For example, earthquakes are something that we nearly only think of as being really bad, terrible things. But without seismic activity and tectonic plates, there wouldn't be life on this planet. It's because of all the rich minerals that come up through the ground, because of all the seismic activity that creates all the life on the planet that allows it to exist. And so it's changing, the way that you look at things and think about things that allows you to see the bigger picture. And we hope that that's, what we can do with our work.
That's something so remarkable about Earthworks, that sort of deep time and formation and evolution of our whole planet, and the ground we stand on is revealed and kind of compacted into this shorter space of time. Actually, we had a few questions from the audience about that kind of relationship, and they wanted to ask that has doing the project of Earthworks changed your relationship to landscape?
I think it's our relationship with landscape and nature that, has led us to directly making this work, because, that's certainly driven both of us throughout our practice, even when we had very individual practices when we were studying fine art at Brighton Art College. We spend a lot of time outdoors in the landscape, trying to think about how we can experience things that are beyond the limits of our perception. And I think when we first turned to science and technology as a way to reveal these things to us, we thought that that's what we were doing. We thought that it was just about extending our perceptions. How can we see landscape evolve over time? How can we enter the time frame that CERN uses to collide these particles? But then through spending time in these science labs, we started to see that there were these signatures and the frameworks that came with the science and technology. So then that's what's led us on to say, looking at nature through these lenses of science and technology, like you see in Earthworks. But I think what's interesting, because we made this work a few years ago, it's always nice to kind of revisit that work and think about it in the light of new contexts, and what's happened certainly sort of over the last couple of years with people thinking about the environment more, being forced to think about the environment more. It perhaps changes how people might read this work or the type of impact that it might have on people. And where you were talking at the beginning about people having these very profound experiences with Earthworks, I think that's certainly been heightened because of lockdown, because of the situation we find ourselves in with COVID. I was wondering before we installed the work whether people would be responding much more emotionally to the work, or they'd be desperate to kind of feel something deeper, or all our emotions are maybe much closer to the surface at the moment. I don't know. That's
such a fascinating layer, I think, in how so many of your projects function. You've spoken a lot about this idea of the technological sublime. So the first hit of the work, I suppose, is this almost overwhelming and this sensory, immersive, experiential thing. But then as you spend more time with it, there's this other layer, this kind of critical layer, I suppose, where you're also simultaneously trying to reveal and critique the apparatus of how we as humans observe and attempt to understand and contain the world.
Yeah. I think that, like I sort of just mentioned briefly, that was something that we realised as we worked through our art practice. So first of all, we looked at the tools And we thought that we were just kind of like, oh, look, we can see landscapes changing. It can enable us to hear and see these things and feel and experience these things. But then more and more we would notice, we made a piece of work called Brilliant Noise, which was kind of one of those early pieces, which we actually showed in Fabrica in 2008. And it was a piece where we went back to raw image data of the sun. So it had been collected by various satellites and ground-based observatories looking at the sun. And when you go back to the data when it first comes out of the experiment, they're black and white images. But they're not just black and white images of the sun as we know them. They're looking at them in different wavelengths, so the sun can look very different. And then they also have lots of visual noise around them. And, these are all the artefacts that are introduced by the capturing technology. And we started to realise the more and more we looked at this raw data, whatever form we were looking at, it would always come with what the scientists would call noise or these errors. But to us, they gave you some sense of how that image or the sound or the data had been captured. And that technology and man and how he observes the world was always present in these images. And so we started questioning the process of science more. It was actually when we were at the Space Sciences Lab, I think we had quite a few revelations there. And there was a solar physicist, Janet Lumen, and she said to us, science is a human invention. It's nature that's real.
Wow.
And up until that point, we'd just kind of really been using science and technology. And then we, at that point, started to ask more philosophical questions about science. And we thought that gave us the right to start asking about how actually is science mediating nature? What happens in that process of capturing nature and then revealing its mysteries to us in some way? And so then we've become much more focused in kind of that information that's coming through with that. And I think, as humans and how our brains work, they're made to kind of filter out a lot of noise. They've become very attuned through evolution to kind of filtering out all that unwanted information. And so we're actually very used to noise on visual, many levels, visually, auditorily. It's just that we remove that stuff. The other night, me and my daughter were hanging out of her bedroom window, like listening to fireworks going off. And then she said, "Is that the sea I can hear?" And there's this, we live by the sea, we don't live near to the sea. And, there's this constant, in a city, there's this constant layer of white noise, which we don't really notice anymore. But she was listening intently, and you could just hear this, and we don't hear that when we're going around the city, but if you stand still and listen. So our brains have become very good at filtering that out, and we keep that visual noise in, or the auditory noise, because actually it makes things more real in a way to us, rather than kind of removing it.
There's something totally profound in that.
Yeah.
Nature is real,
Yeah.
science is made up. That really hit me. And I loved hearing you talk about CERN as well. As you mentioned, I spent some time there several years ago as part of that artist residency programme, because I was so interested in getting closer to how is it that artists can exist in other contexts. And I was so struck by that sense of, it's this huge international collaboration, as you said, potentially a romantic view of the experiment, but it's an incredibly collaborative place. But in my time there, I would say the experience fundamentally changed my relationship to science and the idea of facts and truth, because you realise that people are constantly working to prove, disprove things. Stuff that you was taught in school is now completely rendered obsolete. Yeah. Someone is prepared for their whole life's work to be rendered obsolete if it begins to become closer to a version of the truth. But what we're taught as scientific fact is just a best guess, their best assumption at this time.
Yeah.
And there's kind of an interesting politics in that. Like, I wonder if you could speak a bit more about how that operates in your work and how you want that to land with people that spend time with your art.
It's very topical at the minute. We're right now in the middle of the US election. We don't know who's won. And the whole notion of what is true and what is correct, is, in a way, has been thrown up in the air recently, that people think that facts exist on both sides of the argument now. And it's interesting that for us, the philosophy of science is that it's this way of thinking about the world and finding out what is true, but it's never a finished argument. Science is always a moving target. And that facts come from science, but they're always the best understanding we have of something at the time. And, in a way, we hope that our way that we work with science shows that it's something that you can be creative with, and you can find your truths within it. But that it's never a finished, final argument, because usually when you watch a scientific documentary or you read about science, it's given to you as just like numbers, that it's the answer, it's the finished product. And I think a lot of the problem right now in the world is this idea that there's a lot of people who, because they're suddenly realised, through Facebook and social media, that they're everything is open to a point of view, that you pick and choose what you want to believe. And the reality of science is that it's something that you have to trust science to give you the best answer, but also ask questions. It's not a finished thing. It's an intellectual pursuit of what is the best way of thinking about something, rather than, because science isn't the truth, that you shouldn't just reject it and everything that is not what you agree with along the route. I think that our work often deals with this idea of nature being something that's always outside, so that in a way that reality is always external. You never know exactly what reality is. It's always an interpretation, a translation, and we hope that we can make this into something that's sort of playful, but also in intellectual kind of engagement.
It's a little kind of provocation,
Yeah.
I suppose, to the audience to stay curious and to keep questioning.
Yeah, one of our most successful pieces of work is called Magnetic Movie, and we took the scientific metaphors of interplanetary magnetic fields as playful truths. And of course, they talk about spaghetti on the sun, in this film, and it's clearly a playful translation, but it produced quite an outrageous reaction on YouTube when it was uploaded. It went viral a long time ago, and a lot of people felt that they were being tricked, because on one hand they thought they were watching a straight scientific documentary, and then they realised it was actually a playful example of truth. And these people had never seen something like that before, and it had a very strong reaction. And it's strange to feel that you have to know the answer from something. It can't be something that you can actually build a mental picture from yourself. You want to be given the final answer, but really it's something you have to come to it and find the truth in it yourself. And I think a lot of our work deals with this kind of post-truth thing.
Yeah, it kind of lays things open. It's like laying them open and inviting people to kind of make their decision. So, a work like Earthworks, you can ignore all of that. You don't need to know any of that. You can come and experience the work on whatever level you like. But then, here at Fabrica, there's a video, and you can learn more about the work and the making of the work. And then you can learn more about those ideas. So it's a kind of an invitation to engage. And like Joe says, you can engage on whatever level you want to, and people can approach it in their own way. And I think one of the responses to that is people end up feeling quite empowered, because maybe science presents itself in a way that people don't feel that they're qualified to maybe try and understand it or engage with it. Where in this way, we kind of go, well, come in and see this lovely moving thing. And then you're kind of like, oh, it's that. And so you're coming to it from a different way. And I think quite often curators have used our work, say, in science museums and spaces for like science education. We make them as artworks. We're quite happy for them to be used in that context. They're not telling the truth maybe of science, but or how science would like it to be presented directly. But then people, because people are accessing it in a different way, they feel that they understand something, or maybe they are learning about that particular area of science just through different methods.
looking forward into the future, we are excited to be working with you to present Halo. It will happen at some point. We're not sure definitively when, but we hope it might take place in spring next year. So there'll be a chance for people to come and experience that work in person. But what else is going on for Semiconductor? How are you going to take all of these methods, this body of knowledge that you've been amassing? How are you going to take us into the future?
Yes. Well, we've got a few little projects on the go at the moment. One of them is working with a group of scientists at Dundee University in Scotland, and they are studying light that's coming from distant stars. And then all the accretion, all the dust that comes off of those are gradually forming into planets. So they're trying to understand about how planets form. And so we're currently working with them and looking into the techniques they use to develop those things. And they've commissioned us to make some work from that, which we're currently exploring. And we're trying to find some time to research and think and kind of stand back. We made Halo, and it was kind of this big sort of in-your-face artwork, massive, crazy thing that required a lot of our time and attention. And, sometimes it's just really good to stand back and think about where we're going and what's important to us and what we should be reading and finding time to do all those things.
Yeah, what are your strategies? That's really interesting for feeding and fueling yourself for the next layer.
Well, I think obviously residencies are amazing for doing that, because when we go to residency, they've been anything from like 3 to 6 months. We very much treat that as a research process, and we're in somewhere every day, all day, just researching, consuming, poking our noses in, talking to loads of people, and then gradually some things will filter through. So there's this very much kind of organic process that we go through. But now, I guess, at the moment, with things how they are, we're sort of doing that more remotely, kind of working with people. We're doing interestingly doing more talks remotely to students, and we're very interested in engaging kind of a younger generation and how they're working across science and art. And so it's very much kind of just sort of self-led research at the moment, isn't it? But it's we do need to find time where we can solidly research something, because that dipping in and out can be very complicated.
Excellent. Well, I know that there's going to be another chance to unpack Earthworks in more detail as part of the programme here at Fabrica. There's going to be a panel discussion that really looks at the work in the context of the Anthropocene and digging deeper into some of those questions you were talking about debates about climate change and our human impact on the world. We hope that there's a chance for audiences to come back and see Earthworks again at Fabrica. At the moment, it's planned to open again later in the year. But also there's a really fantastic artist film that you've mentioned, which is also a really, really brilliant watch. So we encourage people to dig into that and to keep sending questions in and engaging with Fabrica on social media, because it really is a work and a series of work that provokes thought, discussion, conversation. So we encourage everyone to continue to be curious and keep sending in questions and comments.
Great.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Joan.
Thanks, Laura.